Thank you very much. It's great to be back and have the opportunity to talk to you all.
Well, it's fantastic. And last week was very popular, and I think we got lots of feedback afterwards. So yeah, delighted to have you here again. I think it's probably worthwhile refreshing everyone as to what space syntax is. So space syntax is an approach to analysing space that was developed by UCL back in the 1970s with some pioneering work. Then it was then developed, space syntax has been developed into a set of tools, and space syntax is also a commercial spin out of that sort of academic research, which is what Anna is as a director of. So they help people, organisations analyse space. So the session we've got today is how we use design to influence customer experience and footfall. So last week we looked very much at the macro level. So we watched in amazement as Anna was able to just pick out streets in a city and tell us what was actually going on at the macro level. So now we'll look at the place level, at the location. And before I hand over to Anna, I do want to mention that these two webinars are an excellent introduction to our new course, which is Spatial Layout and Retail Performance. And it's a day-long course where on the first half of the day, we'll be talking again about how to read a city, and understanding the tools to analyse and look at dynamics at a city level. And then the second half of the day we'll look at the tools in detail to analyse locations and space and buildings as well. So putting it all into context. And Anna may mention a bit about that at the end as well. Last week's, it feels like years in COVID. Last week's webinar is on the space syntax, or will be on the space syntax if it's not there already shortly. So you can have a look at that. You can have a look at that in full. Yes, we'll mention a bit more at the end, and we'll send a follow-up email to those of you who've attended. And I think we've got some, Sonia's got some extra treats for those who've attended as well. So that's all from me, I think. And yes, I'll hand over to Anna.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Okay, so today's session, Spatial Layout and Retail Performance, is, as Natalie said, an introduction to the course we're developing. And it's really about explaining how space syntax tools can help with the understanding of the impact on layout and the impact of layout on human behavior and the experience of places. So we're going to look at different scales of this experience, because as a customer arrives in a retail place or environment, they are going to have to move through these different scales. So they're arriving in an area and then getting familiar at a kind of, let's say, macro scale, and then getting into a place up to the point where they engage with an object in the shop. So we can't really separate out these different scales. The other thing is that we think this is really important in the context of the current COVID-19 situation, because city centers have to rely on a positive experience of their users. Otherwise, it will be very hard for people to actually come to them and feel safe and comfortable and enjoy their experience. And of course, this is very strongly linked to other trends everyone knows about in this domain. The impact of digital already meant that people would be choosing very carefully where they would spend their time, and the experience being ever more important. So this webinar will be this introduction to a number of tools I'm going through, explaining to you and how they relate to the human experience. So I'm going to start again with the city scale. Just a recap from last week's seminar, and for those of you who haven't been there. So at the city scale, this is an example of Cardiff. Space Syntax is using something called a segment model. So it's a spatial accessibility model, which looks at the spatial hierarchy of the publicly accessible movement network in the city. So we're calculating this measure of spatial accessibility, which is taking each segment, and it looks at how is this segment connected to everywhere else? How easy is it to get to everywhere else? So it's a relative centrality, let's say, of every place in the city. And this is a very good sort of scan of a location in order to understand what we call the location potential of a place in relation to what are the, let's say, the main high streets are picked up very well in this measure. But also it's really important at this scale to look at a place. In this case, we're looking at the Cardiff St. David's Centre here, and how it relates to the much more global access points like railway stations and transport hubs. And then also how it relates to the areas outside of the city center where you have residential population. How are they actually getting into the center? So this location potential we measure using spatial accessibility. And you can see these black little arrows here. These are locations where we carried out pedestrian movement surveys. So this is about measuring human behavior. So we always look at measuring the qualities of the built environment as well as behavior patterns. And that allows us to build statistical models, which you see on the right, where we correlate pedestrian movement against spatial accessibility. And typically in well-established urban systems, we get a fairly strong correlation between those two things. So it's a really good basis with relatively little data sources to create a predictive movement model. Now, when we look at location in the city, what as a design principle, Space Syntax and also most of our clients are always looking at creating synergies at the place level between the retail place development and the surrounding context. So we're looking at using these models as predictive tools to understand the impact of different layout iterations. And this is what I'm going to show you next. So how you can use this model to simulate a future design. So here you can see if you create additional permeability, what would be the impact? How strong would these new alignments be? And also what would be the impact on the surrounding city center? So you can see to the west of the center, the street, previously a sort of yellowish green line, turns red. This shows again that you can never look in isolation at a spatial intervention like this. And this is really useful when you talk to other stakeholders, the local authorities, but also other retail stakeholders in the center, that you can show them what we're going to do is not just creating competition, let's say. This is actually creating synergies and creating overall a stronger destination. And that should always be the aim for the center, on one hand, to be successful, have a strong potential to attract footfall, but also to take advantage of the additionality of the other attractions in the area and creating synergies and a bigger, better city center altogether. So as you can imagine, these models are very useful for communicating between different stakeholders. And also, I'm not showing this now, in the course we will be able to look at, for example, looking at lots of different iterations or options, which is a typical design process in projects like this. We're also going to be able to look at many more case studies than we're able in this webinar. But what about a situation where you have a much more isolated place? This is a shopping center outside of Bergen in Norway. It's called Straume Center, and it's one of these early shopping centers which over time had many additions to it. And almost grew organically over many decades. What is happening now, we're not going to show this right now, but what's happening now to this center, this formerly very rural area, has been becoming a suburban area. And now the city wants to turn this into the city center. So what's happening is that there's a lot of development, a lot of other functions around this center, and they're trying to embed this into a public realm outside, in indoor and outdoor spaces, as well as more development, a bigger mix of users supporting, which is also good for the retail function, of course. But what I'm focusing on in this slide is a different methodology we are using when we're looking at a kind of smaller scale. So you see, this is not a segment-based model. This is more like a heat map. And this is what we call strategic visibility analysis. And this is another method we're going to talk about in more detail in the course. And what it does, instead of line segments, we have a grid of cells across the publicly accessible areas. And the computer calculates for each cell how visible is it in relation to everywhere else in the center. So it's what we call visual exposure. It's not just the size of the visual field from everywhere in the center. It's not just about what you see, but how well visually connected are the places you can see. Again, it's a relative visual accessibility value, and that's why we call it strategic visibility. And typically what shopping center or retail clients want to achieve is a relatively even distribution of the visual exposure. So we know that visual exposure attracts people. So people like to go where they can see. That seems to be the experience when we again correlate these values against human behavior. So what we try to do is understand these patterns, and you can relate them to the actual commercial performance of a center. So the right image is actually plotting rent levels, so it's a proxy for the commercial performance. So we can see relationships between the blue areas in the commercial performance and in the spatial accessibility. You see sort of various degrees of commercial parameters and visibility parameters. So then we think about, okay, what could we do in this case? They're going through a stage of redevelopment. They want to make some quite significant spatial changes, but in particular in terms of this visual exposure, what can we do to even it out more? And then again, we can use this as a simulation tool and just experiment with some fairly minor changes of removing some of the kind of visual blockages in certain spaces. Can have a quite profound impact on the overall distribution of visual exposure of shop fronts, new lines of sight being possible. And again, this is very useful before you do something, to just reassure yourself or the design team, the client team, what would be the impact. And in the course, we're going to explain in more detail. There are a number of different measures you can use using strategic visibility analysis, and this will be part of the one-day course where we're going to look at what we can do with this in more detail. Now, we have another methodology, which is an agent-based model. This is typically used at a kind of very detailed level of design because it helps us to predict almost like individual people's behaviors. And this is an example of a department store ground floor. So inside a shop, let's say, a very detailed environment. It's related to where do we place objects in space. For example, different concessions on the ground floor of a department store. In gray, you see all the sort of back of house areas here, which create visual barriers for people. And you see there's almost sort of a grid of a movement structure here. But you also see that within that grid, there will be these more quiet areas. This is really important, again, about the experience, to understand that footfall, everyone wants footfall in retail, obviously. However, there's also such a thing as too much footfall, depending on the type of retail and the type of experience you want to create. So for example, if you want to sell a very expensive watch to someone, you might want to create a more private environment, a more calm environment for that transaction. So you would place that perhaps somewhere in this area as opposed to in this central area, which would attract a lot of activity. What you see on the left again is a survey of actual pedestrian traces. This is also a methodology we're using when we look at things like museums and galleries. So we look at actual, if it's an existing place, actual human behavior patterns. Again, we use that to sort of sense check our models. And we see these relationships between human behavior and the analysis. Now, this agent modeling analysis works similar to many sort of crowd modeling software people might be familiar with, but there's an important distinction. So typically with agent modeling, you would work with a matrix with a lot of assumptions about origins and destinations of these agents. So you come up with a sort of scenario, let's say, of how people might be behaving. And then you ask the computer to run this scenario to see the cumulative pattern emerging from the scenario. And then it highlights bottlenecks and issues and opportunities, which help you to adjust your design. Our agents, they are informed by origins and destinations, like typical software is, but also they have the information of the visibility graph analysis. So we like to say they're spatially or visually intelligent. So the information of where they want to go to is combined with the information what they can see as they move around. So every sort of certain number of steps, they get this information, and they're thinking about sort of their end destination, what they see, and that combination creates a route which is more informed by the sort of visual information of their spatial environment. And we find that this correlates very well to actual human behavior through the studies where we correlated that against human behavior. This is about a quite detailed experience. Could help you, for example, make decisions about where you place different kind of retail, but also things like where you put vertical circulation elements, like the access to an escalator. Where would you put information, signage in strategic locations? And it might help you to identify there's a bottleneck here, or there's a kind of pinch point. I want to do something about this to create a more generous experience. Again, extremely important during our time now, where it's extremely important that people, when they enter a store, they come in and they feel like they're comfortable, they're safe, they're not going to end up in a crowd suddenly. Okay, so I've been going through these different scales and the different methodologies we can combine, because again, as I said at the beginning, we can't really separate them. As a human being, you have to negotiate these different scales of your environment, and you can't really separate them out. And even at the very local situation, you're always aware of your wider context. And depending on the project and the stage of the development, we might start working on the kind of more strategic analysis of a place. This is again the Straume Center, but at a more strategic level, using the spatial accessibility segment model and looking at how it's integrating with, here you see the new development I've been talking about, the new kind of office and residential buildings, and how they're going to link into the existing center. Always looking at actual behavior in order to be able to create statistical predictive models for the design and impact assessments. If available, or ideally if available, we look at the retail performance at a commercial level. This is a shopping center in Japan we did some work on. So again, we can not only look at footfall, but the likely impact on what we like to call place value. And this is also extremely useful if you are a retailer, a landlord, and you want to discuss future rents, tenancy agreements. So for example, we're working on projects which are completely isolated spatially, or projects which are in former brownfield sites, let's say. So there hasn't been anything before. So how does a restaurant owner or a shop owner assess what is going to be the likely footfall if that location basically didn't exist before? So these models are very useful in those sort of negotiations and understanding what to expect in a, let's say, future place which didn't exist before. And then down to, you know, optimizing, this is the Coal Drops yard in King's Cross, circulation patterns and infrastructure, location of vertical access points. So this is looking at the 3 levels and how they connected, and what is going to be the hierarchy of the kind of pedestrian flows. Or you could also look at, for example, landscaping of open spaces in retail developments, and then down to inside the shop placement of objects. Yeah, so I think this is a good overview of the kinds of methods and tools. We're going to talk in more detail at the course, and I think my time is over, and I need to hand over again to Natalie. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. And I mean, I think really what fascinates me about this, all of this, is that you can actually look at the model and analyze design changes without actually going to the capital expenditure of and the non-reversible actual design, you know, and building of extensions and redesigning spaces. I'd like to open it up to questions. So if anybody has got any questions, then yeah, feel free. So we've got a few minutes we've got 5-10 minutes for that. So use the Q&A box at the bottom if you want to ask any questions. But whilst we're waiting for some questions to come through, I didn't mention at the beginning, so that's perhaps why they've not come through just yet. We had quite a lot last week, didn't we? So perhaps I could kick off with a question. I mentioned a couple of times that you shouldn't really implement anything, or nothing really works in isolation. But do you have a view of perhaps what's more important, the macro scale or the micro scale? For example, if the macro spatial layout of a city or whatever is not working or not ideal, is there anything you can do at the micro level that will help, or is it hopeless?
Well, I think the most important thing is if you, let's say you have a spatially highly isolated development, you need to convince people to come there in the first place. So I think what is important, what we call the attractor effect. So if it is something very special, people cannot have this anywhere else, and it has a high attraction to them, they will decide to come there. But that relies on things like brand value and things which are outside of, let's say, the space syntax field. But once they're there, you want to optimize that location. The danger with this approach is also that this attraction might be very relevant right now, but what about in 10 years? So sometimes we work on master plans and we have a very segregated part of the master plan, and the design team says, yeah, but we're going to put a multiplex cinema here and lots of people are going to come here because of this big attraction. And what we say to them is, okay, that's fine, as long as this works. But what about maybe in 10 years, no one is coming to cinema anymore? Maybe, you know, there's completely different trends. And what are you going to do with this part then? So what we always try to encourage is think about in the really long term. And if you create a more evenly distributed spatial structure, which is, let's say, resilient and suitable for lots of different users, it will be more resilient and sustainable in the long term, because you don't have to rely on very specific pull effects which might exist right now but not in the future. So if you go with a good spatial structure which will be successful in the long term for lots of different things, you're more resilient.
And I suppose cities change over time, like you mentioned in Bergen as well. So is there a case for doing this kind of analysis on a regular basis? I mean, is it sort of costly and involved to do, or is there a case for saying, yeah, let's check that this is working on a yearly basis, for example, by using these tools?
Yeah, maybe yearly basis is not necessary, but we do have models of most major UK cities because of the all the projects we've been working on over the years. However, whenever we work on a new project and come back to a place, we check the model and look for recent developments which might have changed the spatial context. So you have to do that. And the other thing we have to do is we need to look at the future development scenario. So we can't just look at our site in isolation and say, okay, what happens if we do this? We always need to look at all the planning applications and committed developments. And we always have a discussion with the design and client team. What should be the assumptions for the future scenario when this is built out? What else would have happened in the meantime in the wider context, which will impact on the place itself.
So that's interesting as well, to pick up on that point, that you've been doing this for quite a long time, so you do actually have a lot of case studies. So you're not always looking at a place fresh. You do have a lot of data across the UK, and I think you mentioned last week that you have a tool that looks at sort of a higher level across the UK that anybody could access.
Yes, so we have, if you Google Space Syntax Open Mapping, you find a map of all of the UK and a number of pre-processed measures you can have a look at your place. However, it's a quite strategic model, so it doesn't have all the detail of every single pedestrian link, but it's a good starting point. We're also looking at a model which looks also at other kind of data. So we call this an integrated urban model, where we're looking at land use and the spatial model and that relationship. That's something we're going to launch in the future. But what we also have is we have a huge database of pedestrian movement data at this sort of level of detail of locations. So at the moment, it's a difficult thing to do any new service because of COVID-19. All the movement patterns are distorted and not really normal. So we can fall back on some of the data we collected in previous years, if it's not too old, and if we have some control locations in more recent times, we can then at least look at the patterns of the data and extrapolate, using population growth assumptions and things like this. So one of the advantages of this modeling is also that when you link it to, let's say, population data, square footage of development, and so on, you can build models without having to rely on pedestrian movement data.
Yes, so you don't actually, I mean, that's the real value of your techniques, is that you can use these mathematical models in the absence of people in city centres, which we're experiencing uniquely right now. So yeah, more valuable than ever. We do have a question from Yusuf in, if I've pronounced your name correctly, so I do apologise if I haven't. He's from Algeria, and he wanted to ask about the techniques of survey. Are photo snapshots relevant in behavioural surveys in urban spaces? What is the difference between snapshots and gate count techniques? So I presume that's about the surveys to back up your kind of mathematical approach. I guess you would use these techniques just to check that what your analysis is correct.
Yeah, there's 3 different types of surveys typically. So the most common one we call the gate counts. So basically here we're collecting flows. Typically in a kind of reasonably busy area, we would count every hour for 10 minutes how many people are passing through a location. And you can see often we look at both sides of the pavement separately. Because often we also look at things like, should there be a new pedestrian crossing somewhere, in order to facilitate easier movement into a location. So that's the gate counts. What you see here on the right, this is pedestrian traces. This is Buchanan Galleries in Glasgow. So we looked at the different entrances and just follow people for a certain amount of time and see what their routes are. So these are manually traced people. So we're looking into ways of, using technology, Bluetooth thickness and things like that. But if you want to get a kind of complete picture, it's still necessary to have either video surveys or things like that. And the third one is the snapshots. And I think we've seen this, you see the yellow dots in this survey. Basically what you do in time intervals, you go through different spaces, you take a literal snapshot, not necessarily by taking a photograph, but by putting dots on a map on your flip chart. And that we do in order to record what we call stationary activity, because we're very interested in which places people like to stop. And we might be marking here, the blue circles are marking people who are interacting with each other. And this is something we, for example, also do in public spaces or in office environments where we're interested in communications patterns. So these are the main sort of survey techniques we are using, but depending on a specific project and research question, we might also invent others.
Well, it certainly sounds very thorough. So with your analytical techniques that you've developed over the last few decades, you're checking them against real numbers on every single project. So yeah, your database must be huge and heaving with all the information. I think that's probably all we've got time for questions, but I just want to mention a couple of things, if I may, on the last slide. If you want to find out more about this, very shortly coming up is the course on spatial layout and retail performance, where we will go through all of this in a lot more detail, so you can actually go away really understanding these tools and how these tools work. And I believe at Space Syntax they'll give you access to tools and show you where to find information and do some analysis. So I think it really is kind of essential for anyone who's looking at regenerating city centres or looking at shopping centres. It's especially right now, it's when we can't actually get this empirical data quite so easily, or empirical data is is fluctuating, then these tools, these analytical techniques really do serve a purpose. Sonia, I believe, will be sending everybody out who has attended this webinar with some special treats. I think there'll be a discount, if you like, on the course that's coming up. So I do encourage you to look at that, and you can find that and details of all of our other courses on the website at Bayfield Training. Last year's, I keep saying last year just because COVID seems so long, but last week's webinar is also on the Space Syntax site, which I think there's details in the chat of that. Remember also, we do webinars every week at the moment. We've been doing webinars for 2 years on real estate. So if you want to attend any of our webinars, if you attend 5 of them, you can come on one of the courses. Spatial layout and retail performance would be a good one to use that discount on of 20%. But as I say, anyone who's attended this webinar will also get some special offers and treats and bits and pieces from Sonia as well. Is there anything you wanted to finish off with, Anna, to say about the course, or anything else you wanted to finish with?
No, I think the most important thing is that with the planning of environments at the moment, more than ever, is to put the human experience at the heart of it. And that's what we're trying to do with the way we have developed our methodologies and tools. And
yeah, I attended a webinar yesterday, which the famous Bill Grimsey was at, and he was sort of expressing his passion to seize the opportunity, this opportunity to reshape city centres. Yeah, what better than to have, you know, some real tools, real analytics to enable to move forward for that. So I hope we'll see you all again at our other webinars and at our upcoming courses. Do check out the tools that they've Space Syntax have put in the chat. We'll follow up with emails, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you very much again, Anna, and yeah, see you soon.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Bye bye.